Well, several years ago when I was on the East Coast, my family and I lived out there, served at church, I had occasion to attend a prayer breakfast on the occasion of the National Day of Prayer, and it was an event that included pastors from many different denominations and as well as other non-denominational churches, churches pretty much of every stripe, as well as a number of government leaders and various other dignitaries. Now, many of you have perhaps seen snippets of prayer breakfasts on the news because it is not uncommon in our country for U.S. presidents and governors of states to be the guests of honor at the prayer breakfast. They happen all over the United States on the first Thursday in the month of May every year. As it turned out, there really weren't very many takers among the UCC clergy at this event. I was just one of, I think, a couple in attendance, and after I was there, I figured out why. And I was one of the very few representing our denomination. I don't know where the other pastors came from, but I knew that they weren't from ours. And it was held in a large banquet room, and there were a couple of hundred tables, at least, round tables, and they were covered with white tablecloth, and they were adorned with some nice silverware and crystal glasses, and there were large pitchers containing ice water. And front and center in the room was a long rectangular table, and it was the head table, and there were nameplates there for the various dignitaries that were in attendance. For the rest of us, those of us who were simply attending the prayer breakfast, there was no assigned seating. It was left entirely up to us to find seats at the round tables in that room. And that is where things got interesting. There appeared to be a mad dash, almost frantic dash, among the pastors in attendance as they were scurrying to get seats as close to the center of the head table as possible. And what's more interesting is that there were some other somewhat famous people and celebrities in attendance who did not have a place at the head table, and they were assigned, just really like the rest of us, to be out there in the peanut gallery with us mere mortals and try to find a seat where they could. And what I noticed at that point is there were a number of pastors literally bumping into each other as they frantically tried to get seated at the same table as one of the famous people. Not simply just near the head table, but with someone important. And I also noticed a lot of photo ops going on. Pastors eagerly posing for pictures with one of the government leaders or celebrity or other dignitary. By the time this whole thing was over, by closer to noon that day, imagine if you were one of the dignitaries or one of the celebrities, one of the VIPs in attendance, you would have posed for a picture with no less than a dozen different people of the cloth, and you would have had thrust into your hand at least a dozen business cards, calling cards, by members of the clergy. Now, each of you can draw your own conclusions from this. But what I witnessed that day left me with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. From my perspective, I saw a number of clergy people who were very quick to cozy up to power. To me, it seemed like they were just a little bit too eager to grab hold of some vestige of prestige. I remember that this past week when I saw what the lectionary was bringing us for today, the passage from Luke chapter 14. Jesus was a meal guest at the home of one of the Pharisees, and when he noticed that the other guests were choosing the places of honor, they were doing that very thing. Let's pick up today here in verse 8a where Jesus says this: "When you are invited by someone, do not sit down at the place of honor." Verse 10, "But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place." In other words, It's far better. It's far better to sit down and coach and get bumped up to first class than it is to take a seat in first class and get kicked down to coach. He said that's essentially what can happen. Verse 11, he gives this warning. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. An important piece of living the Christian life is how it's self-awareness. It's how we see ourselves in relation to other people, to our fellow human beings. Presumption and arrogance have no place in the life of a Christian. I began by telling you a story from the prayer breakfast that I had attended while my family and I lived out on the East Coast, and how turned off I was by the behavior of my fellow pastors at that prayer breakfast. Let me tell you also another true anecdote from that same place where we lived and served, and it's equally true. At the church that I served as pastor, the pastor had a reserved parking spot. It was right in the lot, right near the front entrance. It was right next to the sidewalk. The only other parking places that were that close and that prominent were those that were marked handicapped. But this one was next to that, and it was in a special spot, and it was marked by a large metal sign that said, "Reserved for Pastor." And it was the spot that I used. And I used it not only on Sundays, but I used it other days of the week as well. It was a privileged spot. I felt that I had earned it, and it reflected status and significance. It was also located beneath a gigantic shade tree that provided shade in the warm weather months and kept the interior of my car from getting hot. And it was also the spot, unfortunately, near where our church secretary, who was an animal lover, would bring in loaves of bread to feed the birds. There was a large branch that extended from the tree directly over my car where it parked in its exalted spot. And every single day of the year, except during the winter months when they went to their summer home in Florida, the birds would sit on that branch, and you guessed it, they did their business right onto my car. Literally hundreds and hundreds of bird droppings would sit on my car by the end of office hours each day. And every day, this unconscionable cycle would repeat itself. I would park my car in its exalted and privileged position. The birds would bomb my car. And then my wife or I, one of us, we would take the car and get it hosed off at the car wash. And the owner of the car wash would make about 8 to 10 quarters off of us every day. Stubbornly, I refused to be chased out of my special parking space and parked somewhere clean. Every other parking space in the church parking lot was out of bird range. But I still parked there. Why? Because there was a large metal sign that said, "Reserved for Pastor." And by golly, it was my spot, and they weren't going to chase me out of it. I wasn't going to be deterred by a dozen or so impious birds. Here is where I would offer to each of us a word of caution, and I'm probably speaking to myself more than anybody. We need to be vigilant about our own mental attitude whenever we observe pride and vanity in others. When I shook my head in disgust at my fellow pastors who I thought were grabbing glory, might I have been a little bit self-righteous, if not hypocritical, in my mental attitude towards them? The answer, painfully and honestly, is yes. People who are proud of their reserved parking space are absolutely in no position to be judging other people who happen to like to get their pictures taken with VIPs. Today's gospel passage is a teaching from Jesus that reminds each of us to keep our feet and our heads planted firmly upon planet Earth. Yes, God loves each of us, but in truth, none of us are special. God created us to be part of one kingdom family, not to be our own rulers sitting upon our own thrones. Jesus says, when you were invited by someone, do not sit down at the place of honor. Don't covet a parking space, you silly fool. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Amen.